Hey everyone. Okay. So welcome. On behalf of the Department of English at Ohio State, thank you so much for joining us for this English alumni author panel. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Falter, the undergrad program manager in the Department of English. And thank you for joining us to hear two of our distinguished alumni who are here to read a bit from their work and talk about their experience getting published in the romance genre. We love to welcome all of our alumni back and especially love to hear about what they've gone on to do since graduation. We'll start off with each author reading an excerpt, and then our moderator, Professor Nick White, will kick the conversation off with a few questions. And we'll then open the floor to questions from our attendees. Just so you know, this panel is being recorded for those who may not be able to attend today but would like to watch later. Nick White is the author of two works of fiction, How to Survive a Summer and Sweet and Low. His short fiction and essays have appeared in the Kenyon Review, the Florida Review, Mississippi Review, Electric Literature, Lit Pub, Oprah Daily, and elsewhere. He's also Associate Professor of English and teaches creative writing at Ohio State. Jess Everlee is the author of The Lucky Lovers of London, a series of queer Victorian era romances. She writes her decadent novels from the Northeast Ohio split level she shares with her small family of furballs and fellow humans. She holds a BA from The Ohio State University, where she studied English and gender studies, focusing on Victorian literature and public health topics. She has a deep love of interesting art, offbeat communities, and admittedly pretentious coffee brewing systems. Nora Nguyen is a romance novelist with a yen for quick banter and breathtaking travel destinations. As a lifelong romance enthusiast, looking at you, bonnet rippers, she fully believes in the healing power of a transportive love story. Her debut romance, Adam and Evie's Matchmaking Tour, has been selected as an Amazon editor's best romance for September 2024 and is listed under Goodreads' most anticipated books of the season. She also writes literary fiction under the name Tao Tai. So I will now hand it over to our panel.
You want to read excerpts first?
Read some excerpts.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. I've actually, since my characters are British and I'm not, I've managed to avoid reading my book a lot. So I'm a little nervous. So you can go first.
My characters are not British, but there is one Anglophile wannabe. His name is Atlas, and he's in this chapter I'm reading. So this is the second chapter of the book. It is after a description of a party from Evie's beloved Auntie Howe. And a letter comes to Evie in the mail about 6 months after Auntie Howe's death. Midland, Ohio. This is from Evie's perspective. Evie Pie, I'm dead, it seems. That old witch Priya will take my place as the head of the gardening association, I suppose. What a mess she'll make of things. Her tulips. If you lived in San Francisco, I'd tell you to spy on her for me. Maybe you can arrange some espionage anyway. Instead, you are wasting away in Midland, but not for long. Dear one, I have a proposition. It's a big one. I always intended to leave you my house in San Francisco. After all, you were practically raised there. You can sell it or live in it or set up a crazy artist commune. Just please, no orgies on my crane tapestries. I wouldn't have it go to anyone else. But in my old age, I suppose I've become rather meddlesome. You see, I've decided to add a condition. It's a little one, tiny. You may inherit my house if you agree to go on a matchmaking tour in Vietnam. I've even chosen the matchmaking organization. Love You, get it, is a brand new feminist run tour, perfect for a poetess like yourself. I reserved a spot for you as soon as I heard about it. I know you'll think it out of character for me. After all, I spent years decrying the worth of men. While I don't think a partner is the only answer, I do think you're lonely. And don't talk to me about that Atlas fellow. He's Phineas in wire-framed glasses. You could use a shakeup. I'd like you to have a shot at love with a man or a woman, Auntie doesn't judge, before you become cynical. There are many ways to be brave, but I admit that I was never brave in love. Forgive me for saying I see a lot of myself in you. I suppose one's deathbed can make one morbid at times, regretful even. Why Vietnam, you ask? Well, we are all a bit disconnected from our heritage. Your father would have wanted you to visit the homeland. And as I promised, two birds, one stone. Plus, I thought you might get some inspiration for your poetry. Many of our people were absolute fire, as the kids say, in the poetry department. I put aside some money for your fee for the tour. All you need to do is contact my lawyers and they'll set it up. Because I know how you like to drag your pretty little feet, there are a few clauses. You have 3 months from the receipt of this letter to complete the tour. Photographic evidence of you in the motherland must be sent to the lawyers. If you don't complete your mission, my most beloved, then the house will be sold, probably to some soulless developer, and the funds distributed amongst your grasping cousins. I know, you know, our home, for I have always thought of it as ours, deserves a better fate. But I'm no despot. You don't have to fall in love. You just have to try. And once the tour is complete, even if you have found no Prince Charming to shove in your suitcase, you'll get the deed to the house. Win-win. What's a few weeks to a lifetime of promise? Evie Pie, I love you so much that I think I might burst with it. My hopes for you are myriad, and I hope you will soon find the path to your wildest dreams, even the ones you are too afraid to speak aloud. Auntie How. Evie finds the letter no more sensible after the 100th reading than after her first shocked skim a few days ago. She hasn't told anybody about Auntie Howe's deranged posthumous wishes, save her cousin Lillian Lang Peterson, who squealed with delight and immediately tried to book Evie on the first flight to Ho Chi Minh City. Why the hell not? Lillian had demanded, hands on her pregnant middle. The reasons are many. First of all, can one go on a matchmaking tour if one already has a boyfriend? Not that Atlas has ever registered to Auntie Howe as a serious partner, despite the few times she met him. He turned up his charm, rushing to open doors and pick up the bill at fancy restaurants he'd persuaded them to go to. But Auntie Howe had only sniffed in his direction as if to say, "You don't fool me." Aside from Atlas, there's Evie's job as an adjunct writing professor at Midland College, one that employs her through the summer months and keeps the cockroaches from skittering around in her bank account. And Vietnam, who picks up and hops on a flight halfway around the world with only a month's notice. But that was Auntie Howe to a T. Tempestuous, adventurous, the opposite of the person Evie has become at the ripe old age of 32. Evie shoves the letter back into her messenger bag and fumbles under the squat gnome where Atlas keeps his house key. Unlike her unkempt apartment, Atlas's house looks like it could grace the front of a real estate catalog. With the blue wooden shutters and actual landscaping in the form of bright poppies and leafy hostas, there is not a stone out of sight. She juggles her purse along with a paper bag full of groceries from the gourmet store on Main Street and lets herself in with a key. Even though they're technically not supposed to be dating, it is the worst kept secret in the whole English department, of which Atlas himself is the head. One too many faculty members and students have seen them leaving readings together or heard hastily dashing from his house in the early morning wearing yesterday's teaching clothes. Today is Atlas's 45th birthday, and a particularly melancholy one for reasons Evie cannot uncover. He's been moping over his Earl Grey for the past week, muttering something about mortality and life lessons. Evie, being the good secret girlfriend she is, has decided to cook his favorite meal, beef Wellington with a side of mashed parsnips. Along the way to the kitchen, she passes photos of Atlas at Oxford with his boxing pals, a black and white portrait of a walrus-stashed Thomas Hardy, and a small oil painting of Atlas's deceased hound, Doyle. In the kitchen, she hums as she gets out the pots and pans, scrolling through the ingredients on her phone. While she cooks her way through a very complex dish she has no business attempting, she tries not to think about Auntie Howe's letter and the promising little thrill it gives her. Of course, she can't just go to Vietnam. She has a life here. And she's just learned that parsnips aren't as horrifying as she supposed they would be. But then there's the row house in the heart of San Francisco, a real estate boon for anyone. Evie wouldn't live in it, but she would sell it, which could set her up for a long time. No more adjuncting on a pittance, no more random editing jobs for Upwork. She could finally not worry about money and write. It turns out poetry isn't exactly a get-rich scheme, though she was named the poet laureate of Midland by a portly mayor with faintly veiled literary aspirations. Her debut book of poetry, Auntie House Cabinet of Curiosities, did moderately well, but once the early reception died down, there wasn't enough luster to carry it forward. Since then, she's missed out on numerous opportunities to attend hallowed residencies in the woods, where all the writers sing about their most burning aspirations over an open fire. She's missed out on jobs too, especially ones promising permanency and the dangling carrot of tenure track life. Her agent nudges her monthly about a new manuscript, telling Evie unnecessarily the iron is no longer hot. Perhaps Evie has been in a bit of a creative funk since Auntie Howe's death. She's pondering this as the fire alarm goes off, blaring so loudly that she has to cover her ears with her oven mitts. Smoke billows from the oven. Oh God, she thinks, 475 degrees is definitely not the same as 375. Last time she tries to cook while distracted. Last time she tries to cook at all. Just as she's pulling the beef Wellington out of the oven, she hears the front door open. There's Atlas, pausing in the kitchen archway in a sky blue button down that somehow matches his eyes perfectly. He takes a dishcloth and in one smooth movement bats it towards the smoke alarm, appeasing it enough for the siren to dissipate. He opens a window, then a back door. Then he stares, bemused by Evie's flower-streaked boots, the tangled mess of her hair, the blackened bob on the baking sheet. Well, darling, this is a surprise, he says with a faint British accent. Atlas isn't British, but he has Anglophile aspirations that Evie has always found charming. The accent only disappears when he's been drinking. Then he has a slight drawl from Montana, a man of many accents. She motions to the burnt top of the dish. I don't think it's supposed to be that color, but it's your favorite. Kidney pie. No, Evie says dejectedly. Wellington, beef. Chin up, Evie. The mashed parsnips look just the thing. Huh. Atlas pushes his glasses up on his nose. Happy birthday, she says, shrugging. He laughs and opens his arms to her. She steps into them, thankful that he isn't scolding her for nearly burning down his house. Gently, he rests his chin on the crown of her head. There it is, that mind-numbing comfort that only Atlas can give. She wants to place her head on his shoulder and sleep forever and ever. Briefly, she wonders if this is really what you want to feel in a relationship. Comfort is a beautiful thing, but is there such a thing as too much of it? Thank you.
That was awesome. Good job. Yay. All right. So I'm going to read from a rule book for Restless Rogues, which is the second book in my Lucky Lovers of London series. It's set in 1885. It's a friends to lovers romance between the owner of an illicit queer bar, gay bar, and his very sort of ambitious tailor slash drag queen slash card shark best friend of 15 years. It's a good one to just kind of give the vibe of the series and the setting, I think. So let me get to where I was. There it is. Just shy of midnight on a temperate summer Saturday, with the post-show theater crowd settling in, it was the time David Forrester liked best as the proprietor of the Curious Fox. Nearly everyone who had come tonight was here by now, leaving burdensome roles and rules and even names at the door to wait around like discarded coats for their owner's return to reality. David and his barkeep Warren had gotten everyone their first pour of gin or beer or whatever syrupy concoction they preferred and secured their spots on the private room waitlist. The ebb and flow of arrivals and check-ins was dealt with, and now all that was left was David's favorite thing in the entire world. Keep the incense lit, keep the pianist playing, and keep all his people comfortable, happy, and safe until they stumbled out from his care just shy of daybreak. Considering the habits of the fellows who'd rented them, David knew that the private rooms would be occupied for another half hour at least. With his green leather ledger under his arm, he left his usual post by the piano to make his mid-evening rounds through the brightly decorated front parlor. While he did not own the Curious Fox, David took great pride in every part of the club, from the comfort of his patrons to the details of the decor. He took a little time each night to check that everyone was not just having a good time, but to adjust feathers and flowers in the vases, fluff brocaded pillows, and check the oil in pink-shaded lamps. One of the larger freestanding ones seemed to have gone out, unnoticed by the two gentlemen beneath it who'd scandalously stacked themselves in a too-small chair, quite absorbed in one another. It was lovely to see the introduction David had facilitated earlier this evening turn out so well, though he did need to get that lamp relit so no one tripped on the rug. David cleared his throat, but to no avail. The gents had their eyes closed, their mouths well attached to each other's, and apparently their ears turned off for good measure. Not worth ruining the moment, he decided, rolling his eyes affectionately as he worked around them to refill the lamp as quietly as possible, only to realize he'd left his matches with Warren. Need a light, Amore? The sudden sight of Noah Clark standing close surprised him, but it shouldn't have. Best friends going on 15 years, their feet always seemed to wander to wherever the other happened to be. Tonight, Noah wandered in tightly laced heels, leaning his bustled bum against the back of the overoccupied chair. He often did drag on the weekends, and tonight he donned a decadent frock with puffed sleeves and blue stripes that David thought flattered his face and form better than any of his others. Noah peered nosily at the kissing couple with his kohl-rimmed eyes as he dug a mother-of-pearl cigarette torch out of the excessive puffs of padding he'd put in his evening dress. David grinned and took the smooth, warm torch gratefully. If someone had told him during their first tentative, confusing years of friendship that it would lead them to this precise moment, he wouldn't have even known what that someone was talking about. But a whole lot could happen in 15 years, and so here they were, lighting lamps in David's Molly bar to the sighing sounds of snogging gentlemen. When the task was finished, David passed the torch back, fingers sliding on the black satin gloves that kept his friend's vices of smoking and drag aesthetically compatible. You're a fire hazard, Miss Penelope, he scolded, watching Noah tuck the thing back into the outrageous fluff. Me? Noah said in the dramatic, high-pitched voice he put on for the character of Miss Penelope Primrose. What about these two, eh? He pointed his silk fan at the very busy gentleman, then flicked it open, fanning himself demonstrably as he got off the chair and took David's arm. You're going soft, Davy. I remember when you'd have made them take that heat to an alcove, if not a back room. That's because he was supposed to make them take it to a back room, but as the owner's oversight of the place had dwindled, so had David's adherence to any rules that didn't directly impact safety or the bottom line. It's a business move. David shrugged as they started walking together back toward the bar and Noah's usual card table. Make a perfect match just as the beds are filling, tell them to go wait their turn in a highly visible location, and next thing you know, half the place is inspired to get their names down as well. He glanced back toward the pair. One of them had lost his jacket, and the other seemed to be diligently searching for it down the front of his trousers. Though accustomed to this atmosphere he'd purposely created, David still flushed a bit in spite of himself, suddenly very aware of Noah's clutching his arm and the sweet, oddly familiar scent of whatever perfume he'd put on tonight. Seeing his friend done up like some society girl always did odd things to his nerves if he wasn't careful. Those two might inspire 3/4 of the place, actually, if they keep going on like that. Oh, Noah purred and nudged him. You inspired, David? I am working, David said definitively. You? Working also. Noah nodded primly toward his card, coin, and cup-covered table where his similarly dressed companion, Annabelle Archer, was counting her winnings beside their dandyish friend, Charlie Price. Charlie was comforting a rather surly clerk named Mr. Brighton, who was a regular patron, but not part of their usual circle of friends, and bringing in quite the wage, if I do say so myself. Once they got to the table, Mr. Brighton looked up at David, shaking off a bemused Charlie. Mr. Forrester, Brighton snapped, I hope you're here to tell her she has to give me my money back. David looked at Noah, who'd turned unconvincingly innocent eyes on him. Miss Penelope, he said slowly, what have you done this time? Charlie's attempts at neutral comfort broke with a spectacular snort of laughter, which he quickly tried to hide by sipping from his gin and tonic. It's not funny, really, he said, more to the melting ice cubes than to Brighton. My apologies. I should think not, said Brighton. Cheating isn't humorous. The seriousness with which he said it did Charlie in completely, his face going red as he put his forehead down on the table with giggles. Annabelle rubbed his back in soothing circles, suppressing a sly, well-rouged grin. Noah picked his abandoned cigarette up out of the tray, bringing it to his painted lips and puffing on it before insisting on a breath of smoke. I followed every rule to the letter. Of course, David said, and which of your rules did he object to in the end? Noah smiled that bright, mischievous grin he'd been giving since day one. Whether in response to the strictures of boarding school life, the upright expectations of his intellectual family, or the rigid image requirements of his job as a Savile Row tailor, Noah always grinned like this in the moments he found a handy loophole or technicality that would let him do as he pleased. At the Fox especially, he had a tendency to build those loopholes in for himself. Which rule did he object to, Miss Penny? David repeated, as scolding as he could manage under the influence of that striking smile. Nothing too complicated, Noah insisted with a languorous certainty. Just the one that plainly states that nothing beats una copia di regine. He lifted the swirling cigarette toward Annabelle, his playing partner, who looked nearly as pleased with herself as Noah did. That means nothing beats a pair of queens, Annabelle clarified in a smug whisper. Trying to keep from losing himself to laughter along with Charlie, David crossed his arms tight and turned to Brighton. Please tell me you did not agree to that rule before the game started. He did, Noah chirped before Brighton could answer. He agreed to it along with all the rest of the rules, and you know it's not cheating if everyone agrees to the rules ahead of time. That last bit came as a chorus, as Annabelle and Charlie recited the oft-repeated phrase right along with the ringleader. Yes, Brighton huffed, standing up to address David quite seriously, but I assumed she meant the cards themselves. She might have won if she'd had a pair of queens in her hand, but once it was over, she insisted that since she and Miss Annabelle were a pair of queens at all times, they didn't need the cards and locked in the win before we even started. It was becoming more and more difficult not to succumb to laughter. While Noah was known for inventing all sorts of confusing games, this was ridiculous even by his usual standards. Miss Penelope, he said, voice straining with effort, I hate to say it, but I think you might have gone a bit too far. What? Noah gasped, readying himself to smack David's rump with the fan. David caught the wrist in time to slow it, but Noah managed to sneak a little tap in anyway. I disagree, Mr. Forrester. I disagree heartily. Normally, David let this sort of thing go, but with Brighton proving to be an even worse loser than Noah was, he thought it best to smooth the situation over. In a place like this, people could go from friends to very dire enemies rather quickly. Keeping tensions low was one way he kept his patrons, and Noah most especially, safe. He made Penelope and Annabelle hand over their winnings, which he returned to Brighton, minus a shilling. For the house, David explained, waiting until the chap had wandered off grumbling before dropping the coin down the front of Noah's dress. You do deserve something for that one, he said. A pair of queens. Brilliant, really.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you both so much. And thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to talk to them, ask them a few questions. While I'm asking them questions, I want you all to be thinking of questions. I am going to come out to the audience and do my best Sally, Jesse, Raphael, and allow you to ask these authors questions. So be thinking while we're having a conversation. No pressure. So thank you both so much for being here, and thank you for reading from your work. I am coming out of the closet as an unabashed romance fan, and both of you have written these wonderfully swoon-worthy books that were just such a delight to read. Like, going home every night to these books was just amazing. I'm in a long-distance relationship, and I wanted to know, my first question, and you can take this take this anywhere you want, but what first drew you to the genre of romance? And what was the moment where you decided, you know what, I think I want to try my hand at this genre?
So I admittedly, like when I was an undergrad here, it was not a very positive, we did not have a positive attitude of romance. And that includes myself. I'm not going to pretend that I was different. Like there was a very negative attitude, and I was here for that. So it actually wasn't until shortly before, it was before the pandemic, but only by a little bit. For some reason or another, I read a romance book called The Siren by Tiffany Rice. I don't know if anybody has heard of her. Oh my gosh, she writes under Meg Schaefer as well. If you've read, I just read The Lost Story. Oh, you got a better. Oh my. Okay, I'm starstruck now. Okay, so anyway, I read one of her romance novels, and it was so good. It was like the craft was there. It was just the prose was there. Everything that I had been led to believe was not in romance was all there. And so I realized I had made a dreadful mistake. And so I started sort of experimenting with reading the genre, and found that I really enjoyed it. I think that the misconception that it is trash is just because there's a lot of volume, and not all of it is like for you in particular. Like it might not be what's right for you, but that doesn't mean that there isn't other stuff in there that you might enjoy if you actually go looking for it. I didn't realize there were so many subgenres and time periods, and just like it's just a huge amount of books, and so many of them are so great. And then I decided to write it because I was writing fantasy for years, and trying to break in, and I had, book on submission, and I had different projects that I was working on, and just I couldn't do it. And I was getting so sick of every time I sat down to write, I had to like make a new magic system and rebuild physics. And I got to the point that I had to write a new book, and I'm like, I don't want to do it again. I need to write something else. So I decided to try writing a romance because it would be shorter, and I was enjoying reading it. And I knew that there was a self-publish market for romance in a way there wasn't for fantasy at the time. And so I figured if I couldn't get a traditional contract, that I could still self-publish it in the end if I needed to. So I didn't really expect it to go anywhere. I didn't really expect to get a traditional contract, but it ended up, the timing worked out. My publisher happened to be sort of looking for like their gay Bridgerton at the moment that I submitted. And so that's how I ended up in romance. And it's been a lot of fun. I enjoy it. The community is really great. The other authors are really great. The readers are great. So that's how I ended up here.
That's great. I cannot wait to tell Tiffany that you said that. She's gonna love that. So I started reading romance for the very simple reason that I was not supposed to be reading romance. I so there was a summer when I was 10, and we had just moved into this new house that was down the street from the library, and this was in the 90s. So back then, your parents could just, they would drop you off wherever. You'd be like, where am I? You'd look around and be like, why are there no adults around me? So she would leave me at the library sometimes during the summers, and I would just go through and read all the shelves. And I read the books you were supposed to read, like The Island of the Blue Dolphins and Bridge to Terabithia. But then I found these covers and they were so pretty. It was like these beautiful peachy skinned women on bucolic farmland in bonnets looking off into the distance. And then there was some dude in suspenders behind her. And I was like, what is
Perfectly
this?
built dude in suspenders.
What is this? Yes, it was a bonnet ripper, which is the Amish version of a bodice ripper, because you tear the bonnet off and things happen when the hair cascades. So I started reading those, and those were great because the covers were so chaste, unlike the bodice rippers, that my parents didn't know anything. They were like, "Oh, great! This looks like wholesome content," and it was. It was it's a bonnet ripper. It was wholesome. But I fell in love with the genre right away. And then I slowly moved into Regencies. And then there was a subset of Regency that was Harlequin. And back in my day, we did not have alien romance, blue alien beast romance. So things were a little more limited, but I found my way around that little library, let me tell you. And then I just went on and I did other things. I got my creative writing degree. And I ended up in this job I really hated in my early 30s. It was at a tech startup. The CEO had like perched himself inside the same office as me, and he would like launch directives at me from across the room. I was so miserable, so highly miserable. So I would go to the coffee shop early in the morning, and because I just needed something for my creativity, something that would make me happy, I turned to the genre that I love so much. So I tapped away on this romance, and it was the first book of fiction I'd ever written. And then nothing ever really happened with it. I didn't try very hard. And then 10 years later, I got into publishing in another genre, and it was kind of a heavy book. It took a lot out of me emotionally. And so again, I felt myself wanting something that was fun and light and exciting. And so tap. And I showed it to my agent, and she said, well, why not? Let's just show it to them and see what happens. And my editor happened to be, again, luck and timing, a closeted romance reader as well. And so she said, well, let's do this. And so they ended up buying a book in literary and a book in romance. And the romance book was Adam and Evie. So that was a really long-winded story. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. That was great. Speaking of bonnet ripping, to
As
go
we do.
back, yes. One of the great things about both of your books, that you both do really well, that it's really hard to do, or at least I find it hard to do, no matter what genre you're writing in. It's writing chemistry among people and writing attraction and being able to sustain that for a full novel. I found it so admirable and so enthralling in both of your books. And so, since we have a lot of aspiring writers out here, I was wondering if you had any tips for crafting the romance between your characters.
I'm thinking if you have an answer.
Sure. Well, so for me, I think this is true in life too, but what has always attracted me to people, whether romantically or with friends, is the humor that you find, that common sense of humor and the banter. And so I think such a big part of romance is in the dialogue. The meaningful touches are nice, the bedroom scenes are very nice, but then there's the way they speak to each other and the way they sort of needle one another's weak points, as well as the things that make them special special and unique. And I think the romances I've enjoyed reading are the ones where the protagonists really challenge one another and their preconceptions of who they are as people. Um, Romance is so great for so many reasons, but I think when it's strongest, it can really uplift individuals to a place that is different than where they started. It's about the characters' journeys together, but also their journeys as individuals and how they can kind of provoke one another to the next stage, even though it can be uncomfortable sometimes and funny and wonderful in other times.
I think what's helpful for me is to just build characters that I personally really like and really like spending time with, and then almost as each character is talking about each other, they can be experiencing the things about those characters that I like. So it's in building ones that people that I find to be funny, or they're charming in some way, or their brokenness is some very interesting one that is like sort of fun to poke and prod at. My definition of liking these characters is maybe a little bit mean, but so it goes. And I think that then that's able to sort of come out on the page. I'm trying to think of what, because another thing that comes to mind is just my first two books, and then one I'm working on now. The characters just really, really like each other. They get along very well. They don't fight much, and the chemistry really just comes from how much joy and comfort they get from each other every time they're on the page together. But then I did my third book is one where they do not like each other, and so I was trying to think of what is in common. And I think what's in common is that those ladies in the third book, I just like had crushes on both of them, and I love them both, and then I can like put that just fascination with the character into the other character, and then just try to kind of get that down onto the page, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about the style in which both of your books are written, and it is true that uh both of your books, they jump from the point of view of each character that's falling in love with the other person, or sort of circling each other. And I think what both of you said about like the idea of a great romance, or an interesting romance, a provocative romance, being like the two people challenge each other in certain ways. And I mean, I think that goes all the way back to like Shakespeare, and why I like watching like As You Like It or Twelfth Night or Much Ado About Nothing, like seeing these characters verbally spar with each other. It's just really fun, and to sort of experience. I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit, as someone who is new to the genre and getting into like the different subgenres of the romance and the world, because it feels like in the past 5 years or so, there's really been an explosion of different genres. We can go into the Ruby Sparks of it all, the blue alien romance. That's her name, right? Yeah, the blue alien romances of it all. But like, there's also been like, a big explosion in queer romance, a big explosion in, just like different types of voices being represented in the genre that hasn't traditionally been there. And so I was wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about that, maybe.
So in terms of the subgenres specifically, something that I found really interesting about romance when I started learning about it is that those have actually always been there. They just weren't always easy to find or readily available. There like weren't blue aliens at Target, but there were blue aliens on the internet, on Kindle Unlimited, and like the sort of self-published space. And so that's something that I find fascinating, is that it has been a huge genre with all these subgenres forever. And then some of the, there's like you said, there's Amish, there's thrillers, there's Amish thriller romance, there's historical romance, there's canine, like working dogs, like cop dogs and like firefighting dogs, but they aren't in love. Like the people who train the dogs are in love. Like there's like all of this stuff, like any little thing you could come up with. And I think it must be like the internet that's just like bringing this stuff to the forefront and just making it a lot more visible. Because my understanding is that it's all sort of been there, but now we all know it's there, and now we all learned we're all freaks for blue aliens apparently. But before, that was just super niche. So I suspect it's the internet. It might also just be that it's out in the open now and people are less embarrassed, and as soon as somebody admits it, then maybe somebody else will admit it as well. I think we're all sort of becoming less closeted in our romance reading lives, and I think that results in more of the stuff that was in the background finally coming forward.
I think fan fiction was also a big
Oh, yeah.
gateway for so many people. And a lot of the books that, we know and love now, like Twilight um, and 50 Shades of Grey, they began as works of fan fiction. So there's a real democratization of the genre, which is always nice to see, because publishing is still, and probably will be for a long time, it's still a tricky place to get started in, especially if you're a marginalized person or a woman of color, person of color. But yeah, I think during the pandemic, that represented such a huge surge in the market for romance. Emily Henry was really at the forefront of that. But I think it was the moment when book talk and book sharing also became such a vibrant space too. And so I think with people sharing the books, you're uncovering things you didn't know about before. Authors are seeing themselves in places they might not have before. So it just feels like a giant rush into a space that's really warm and welcoming.
I want to talk a little bit about writing and publishing. And I was wondering, both of you write in different genres, fantasy and romance, fantasy and literary fiction. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, and perhaps I'm the only one who's interested in this, but like I'm nerdy like that, just like your writing practices and like are you able to work on multiple books at one time? Do you have different rooms in your house that you work on one book as opposed to the other? Like how do you manage it?
So yes, I do work on multiple books at once, but not by choice. Sometimes it's just a matter of deadlines coming up at certain times. And it's really hard because sometimes you're writing in this space where things are really intense and you're on a crime spree of some sort, and you're like doing an art heist, and then you turn around and you have to make people have cutesy looks across the room at one another. And so it does feel like whiplash sometimes. But I think one of the things that helps is, setting the mood for yourself. Wink, wink. So you just, for me, it's consuming media that puts me in that mindset. So if I know I'm switching to romance and that's kind of the order of the day, then, I might have a Meg Ryan movie on in the background or something, or I might be listening to music that makes me feel really light and happy and reminds me of a specific time, or I might read, a chapter of another romance novel. It just gets your mind kind of greased to come out on the page in the way that you intend.
Those are good ideas. I'm going to take that advice too. I'm very disorganized, so I don't like drafting more than one book at a time. I have not gotten into a situation with deadlines where I have to draft two books at the same time, which is fortunate because I find that to be very challenging. I do draft and edit another book at the same time. And especially with deadlines, like you do eventually kind of have to do that to be able to keep a certain pace. But I kind of like to write like the first third of a book, and then I go back to whatever project I finished and, start editing that. And then after some edits, return to the drafting and kind of bounce back and forth between the new material and the edits. I prefer edits to drafting most of the time. I like that. That's where everything starts to come together and look really tidy, and it starts to feel like a book. Drafting, every time I draft, I'm like, have I ever done this before? Can I write a book? This is so bad. But the most of my stuff comes out in those edits. In terms of like my writing space, I do have an office. Do I use it? Sometimes I'm just at the dining room table. Sometimes I write in a notebook. Sometimes I'm at a coffee shop. I'm all over the place, just wherever I can find kind of time and space and caffeine, I will be there working on things. Right now I'm trying to draft more on paper, just because I feel like my eyes are getting very dry. So, and there's just so much text and screen that, at least for drafting, I'm trying to spend a little bit more time in front of a piece of paper, because editing pretty much all has to happen on the computer. So
So could you both talk a little bit about breaking into the publishing industry and romance? Um, aspiring writers here, people interested in the genre, like what sort of advice or tips would you give besides, of course, having a good writing practice and writing and loving the genre that you're writing in? What are some like practical things that you could give our students?
Practically, I think the most important thing for me has just being able to move on to another project. And I have watched, unfortunately, like other friends and things who have gotten like so attached to a project, they just keep trying to make it happen for just like year after year after year, and they get kind of stuck. I kind of try to advise people who are especially kind of starting out and kind of just trying to figure out where they fit in the writing space. Just you're full of stories. Any story, like maybe if some book that you're writing is meant to like be your big book at some point, it will be eventually. It doesn't mean it has to be the first one that you publish. So be open to other stories, other ideas, other genres. Kind of stay flexible and just trust that you have more stories to tell, and the next one's probably going to be better. So I actually wrote 13 books before I got published. I queried several of those. One of those went on submission to publishers and didn't sell. It was a lot of books, and quite honestly, I could have written more without getting published if not for sort of a lucky timing, because timing is sort of a tricky thing in publishing, because you've got to like be on some kind of trend that somebody's looking for, but books take too long to actually write for you to have predicted that. So there is a little bit of just like magic timing that kind of has to happen with your query, your submission, and the book that you happen to write in the market at
Thank
the
you for
time as
sharing
well.
that, because I think that so many times I see my students and even myself get so like attached to one project that we fear moving on. And just like hearing that is just so freeing because it does take time.
It does. And the next thing you write, I almost guarantee will always be better than the last thing that you wrote. And then those skills, if you want to go back to that thing you were working on, you now have more skills to be able to edit that thing and make it better than it was before. So more books, the better. Stay flexible, keep writing, stay inspired, that kind of thing.
So I feel like one of the things I'm always balancing as a writer and a professional in the industry is that balance between knowing the market but not letting it rule you, because I do think there is definitely a benefit to understanding what is driving the romance market, what is driving your ambitions, because ultimately we do want to get published. So we do want to enter the world of publishing with a savviness about what to expect and what to not expect. But that should never dictate the kind of book you write, because as Jess said, it might be right now might be the time for blue aliens, but that it probably won't be the case in a year and a half, 2 years from now when you're publishing. So what you're doing is writing to an oversaturated market that will have no interest in that book really soon. So you can't control the market, but you do have to understand it, in my opinion. And the only way to really do that is to read really prolifically in the genre you're interested in writing in and to be genuinely interested in it. I cannot tell you how many people have said to my face, I should write a romance because that is really easy. That's easy money. And it's just, aside from just that being like a mean thing to say, it's unrealistic because you can't fake it. You can't fake your interest in something for 300 and something pages. If you want easy money, I promise you there are ways to get it that don't require you sitting in front of a laptop for years. So yeah, be genuinely interested in your genre, read, make community, and yeah, like Jess said, don't stop writing.
I can attest to someone who's tried to write romance. It is just as hard as literary fiction or any other genre. I mean, it takes the same brain cells. Yeah.
In some ways, I actually find that it's harder because it is such a saturated market. So your concept, I promise you, whatever you come up with has been done before. So that can be really tricky.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I now think that maybe I'll open it up to questions from the audience. I will come up to you. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
Um, Uh, okay. How do you go about making character interactions seem natural and not scripted? Like not just the romantic interactions, but like friendships and platonic and familial.
That's a good question. Do you want to answer?
Sure.
So I read all my dialogue out loud. I used to do a lot of theater, so that's helpful for it, but I do make sure that all dialogue sounds natural when read out loud. So that's one big tip. And you know, you don't have to do it in the coffee shop. You do it alone, and you don't have to do it in front of anybody. But I do suggest reading dialogue out loud. As something to help for that particular piece. In terms of the non-dialogue aspects of these relationships, I think just understanding the history of the two people who are on the page together, how they feel about each other. You don't need to do like some huge deep dive into every single one of their interactions ever, but having a few ideas of like, you know, if you're talking about a familial relationship is, you know, what kind of understanding what kind of familial relationship it is, how do they speak to each other? How is the way they speak to each other different than the way they speak to their lover or the way they speak to their friends? And I think there being a difference between how people speak to one person versus another throughout the book is part of what makes it seem more natural as that book progresses, because we all talk differently to all the different people in our lives.
I think part of that too is just being, and this is just part of writing any genre, is just being really good about observing people and to take every opportunity you can to people watch and to see what people are wearing and how they're sitting and how they play with their hair in certain moments, what strange vocal tics they might have. These little details, I think, will really make interactions feel natural and lifelike and relatable as well. And I'll also say that one of the things I've found is that you usually have to write a lot more than what ends up in your book. I recently was told by an editor to cut 20,000 words. That's 100 pages. And I sort of moaned about it for a while. And she said, but you needed to write those words to get to these characters. And so some people kind of wake up knowing who their characters are. They sort of like have a picture of them fully fleshed. And some writers like me take a lot more time to get to know the characters. And often that means writing scenes that don't end up in the book, scenes where they're getting groceries or playing with their dog. And these are the things that it's extra work, but it's extra work that will pay off.
Nice, nice. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was gonna ask, so you mentioned how like writing extra scenes kind of helps build your idea, like who the character is. I was gonna ask additionally, so like when building characters, how do you like do like the preliminary map out of like, okay, what's this character's background? What's their importance? Like how do you like map it out and then like actually like remember and utilize it?
So from a practical standpoint, I use Scrivener, which is I think it was $100 the last time I bought it. But it's a great drafting tool for me because I can be very type A about certain things, and it has these templates for characters where you write their ages, where they're from, what their parents are like, and it just really gives you a really clear outline of what to do. But you of course don't need Scrivener for that. You can do that anywhere. So that's a resource that I use too. I don't know. Do you have any other ones?
So you mean for actually like the template that we might be using, or just like, okay, how to keep track of all those things? Yeah. Basics about them. I just kind of jot a few things down and start writing. I just usually have sort of an idea in my head with a few just notions. And then I just kind of start going and I just explore and see where it goes and see who the characters end up being. I'm not super organized about it. I have found that when I do make a lot of character notes and things like that, I don't end up using them. Maybe that's useful subconsciously or something, but I find that most of the character work gets done kind of on the page. And then when my character does something very interesting or says something interesting, I'm like, oh, I like that. That's going to be part of who they are. And then I can kind of edit back in and make sure that character is consistent with all of the cool things that kind of come up in that drafting process. So it's not a super like practical answer for you. I'm sorry, but it's just kind of like finding the vibe and writing those interactions, kind of like you were asking about writing interactions with other characters, how I discover things. And then I can kind of make notes on the side as I work through it. And then in a series, I just have side characters and I'm like, oh, I know this bullet point about like David and Noah were side characters in the first book in the series. I was like, well, I know this, and this. Why are they like this? Where did this person come from? And kind of go from there.
And another tip that I will do sometimes when I'm starting out with the characters, I'll lean on a lot of those personality type tests. And it doesn't, it's not a substitute for that important character work you're doing on the page, but it will sometimes get you started. So by that, I mean like a Myers-Briggs or an Enneagram. And you can say, okay, so I am picturing a character who is an Enneagram 2, and these are her buttons that can be pushed, and these are her strengths. And so sometimes that can be a good kind of initial tiptoe into the world of character building.
I sometimes have my students do their character star charts, and that's really useful.
I use the Enneagram too. That's a great one. Love the Enneagram.
We have about 5 more minutes. Anybody else would like to ask a question?
I'm not sure if you actually have an answer to this, but between the drafting process and then your subsequent editing process up until you attempted to get published, do you know like how many hours you actually put into the works you did publish and how many, like a week, how long this whole process took you for these books you released?
Do you have an answer for that?
It's different for every book, I will say. Some come a lot easier than others. Adam and Evie was pretty, because I wrote it in that kind of like state of like really wanting to be excited and do something. I was just like really into it, but I've definitely had books that will take longer. So, the book I'm working on right now, I will say has taken almost 2 years completely, but Adam and Evie took maybe 6 months. So it really can vary.
I don't know on like a daily or weekly thing because it varies a lot just depending on deadlines and kind of what's going on. Ideally, I write for just like a couple hours in the morning most days a week. So I'll just kind of like spend from like maybe 8 to like 11, like really working on stuff and then kind of be more like thinking about it in other areas of the day, but that work gets done there. How long it takes to draft. Before I had deadlines, it would take me about a year to get a book in good shape, like to write it and then edit it to a point that it felt like it was, ready to be queried or something like that. On deadline, it's been all over the place. So I just had to write the 4th book in my series in 4 months. Yeah, I was like, my agent was like, she wants to know how long this will take you. I was like, I could get them something in 4 months and I get them something good in 6 months. And they're like, we'll take it in 3.5. And I was like, okay, I guess your standards are not so high right now. But yeah, so I wrote a draft in like about 4 months and then had to rewrite it in about 6 weeks. So it just kind of, I will never do that again. I should not have said yes to those deadlines, but lesson learned. It just depends. Ideally, I love to have a year, but I don't get a year anymore.
One more? Anybody? Oh, thank you.
When dealing with a project that you're passionate about and want to put work into, but you find yourself dealing with writer's block, but again, like you want to put like effort into this like project, like how do you find like that motivation to get yourself out of that block?
Most of the time when I'm blocked, it's because I've made a wrong turn in the story. So that might not be the case for everyone, but generally if I'm very passionate, if I'm enjoying the project, if all is otherwise kind of going well and I just don't want to do it, usually if I kind of go back a scene or two, I'll find that I've sort of made a mistake. And so I'm not interested in it because I made some boring choice at some point. So that would probably be like the first thing I would go to look at is just like, is there some other choice I could have made earlier in this draft that would make this fun again for me?
That's really smart. I think I'm going to steal that tomorrow morning. Well, for me, I think so much of it is, showing up and just being there for even through those periods of blocks. And sometimes I think as writers, especially writers who might have limited time frames in which to work, you feel such pressure to feel that every word you put on the page has to lead to something. But I would encourage you to allow yourself to play and to know that there will be some bad words that come on the page. There will be lots of words that you don't use. But if there is a scene or a moment that feels really tricky for you, sometimes I'll approach it the way I might approach some other creative act, in that I will find another way into it. So if you're struggling with a chapter, for example, one of the things I will tell people to do is maybe just write only dialogue. Don't write anything in between. Just write it as if it were a movie script. Or I will say, what is the vibe of this moment? Can you make a playlist for it? And does music unlock something in you? Or maybe there's a way in which, make yourself a Pinterest board, an idea board of some sort. I just think so much of the work that goes behind storytelling is not what happens when you're typing, but what happens when you're thinking and you're feeling the story. And for me, somebody who's very obsessed with productivity and living in the culture we live in which our time is so rationed and it's often sold, we need to find a time as creatives to really play again and to allow ourselves that freedom and that joy.
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you again for coming for visit us. Let's give them a round of applause again.